If I can have Donna come up. So I began talking with Donna a little bit, and I've actually invited her to come out and share a bit of her story and share a little bit about what God's done in her life. And so I find it interesting that I had to read by way of British news about somebody in our backyard from Altona, but that's how God works. And so I'm excited that she's here. I just want to bless her and pray for you, and then turn it over to you. So Heavenly Father, I just thank you that you've connected us, Open Door and Donna. I thank you for your faithfulness in her story. And Lord God, I just pray right now that you would bless her words, that they would be your words, that your heart would beat in what she's saying. And Lord God, that you would be with her and that our hearts would be open to receive. I pray all of this in your name. Amen.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank Jason for inviting me to spend this Sunday morning with you. I have shared my story with many audiences over the years, usually with those working in the medical field, where I approach the story from a medical patient perspective. Today I will share some of that, but I will speak more from a spiritual perspective and how this incident has affected my spiritual journey. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is the picture that's going to be up on the screen. We'll just wait for 2 seconds. There you go. I came across this quote a few years ago, and I loved it. It really spoke to me. Life isn't about waiting for the storm to pass. It's about learning to dance in the rain. As you will hear, life for me is very different from what it used to be. But God has taught me that even in the middle of a storm, He will give us the strength to dance in the rain. I've been told many times my story is very difficult to listen to, but believe me, it's much more difficult to live it. I will take you on a journey through the darkest days of my life. It took me 6 months to find the strength to tell Brian, my husband, all of the details of my experience. And it was about a year before I was able to share that with our children. Some parts were so traumatic for me that I locked them away in my heart until I was ready to deal with them. There are still some things that are locked away deep, deep inside. But this is my story. 9 years ago, I experienced something that the medical world refers to as a critical incident. I'd gone to the hospital with a severe abdominal pain. So in order to help with the diagnosis, I was sent to another facility for exploratory surgery. I was given a general anesthesia for this procedure, and I clearly remember the anesthesiologist putting the mask on my face and telling me to take a deep breath. This wasn't the first time I'd had a general anesthesia, and I'd never had any issues before, so I never gave it a second thought. I remember waking up and thinking that the surgery was over. Things were a little fuzzy at first, which I knew to be quite normal following my previous surgeries. So I was lying there thinking, oh, this one was a breeze, until I heard the surgeon speak. And the words I heard him say were, "Scalpel, please." At this point, I became fully alert and realized that the surgery was not over like I thought, but just beginning. And needless to say, I panicked. I could hear my heart rate on the monitor, and it kept going faster and faster and faster. The surgeon told me later on that he'd looked up at the monitor when he heard my heart rate go up, and it showed 148 beats per minute. I tried to move to let them know something was wrong, but the paralytic that I'd been given kept me from doing so. My heart was racing, but the respirator was set at the predetermined speed of 7 breaths per minute, and so I felt like I was suffocating. Try to imagine your heart racing at 148 and only getting 7 breaths in 1 minute. It can't be done. I needed to take a breath, but I couldn't. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I tried to cry, but I was so paralyzed, I couldn't even make tears to cry. I was quite literally trapped inside my body with no way to let them know I was awake, and there was absolutely nothing I could do about it. I clearly remember the burning sensation of the scalpel as the surgeon made the incision. Again, I tried to scream. The pain was so intense, I thought I was going to die. I heard the surgeon say, "She's in distress, she's in distress." He then asked the anesthetist, "What's wrong?" And one of the nurses assisting in the surgery told the surgeon the anesthesiologist wasn't there. He asked where he was, and the nurse replied that she didn't know. The surgeon then told the nurse to go find him, and I heard the door squeak as she left the OR. I was confused. I couldn't understand why he wasn't sitting near my head watching over me. He had left the OR, and no one knew why or where he had gone. I heard the doors to the OR squeak again, and I heard the nurse return along with the anesthesiologist. I was so glad he was back, and I prayed that he would notice I was awake and give me something so I could go back to sleep. That didn't happen. Unfortunately, he didn't recognize the signs of anesthesia awareness. There are varying degrees of awareness, and I had the worst kind you can have. Some people will wake up during surgeries and go right back to sleep. Some may remember hearing a certain comment, or some might remember feeling of a little pain. Usually, these symptoms are relatively minor, and the error is caught quickly. I was the exception. I woke up within minutes of being sedated and remained awake through the entire procedure. I felt the pain, and I have full recall of everything that happened during the surgery. I remember the surgeon, what he said during the procedure. I felt him inserting instruments into my abdomen. I felt my organs being moved around as he examined them. I even heard him make the diagnosis while he was operating. And in that moment, I knew I would need another surgery in the very near future. That was too much for me to handle at that point, and I just pushed the thought away. I tried everything I could think of to occupy my mind. I prayed that the paralytic would wear off. Usually when abdominal surgery is done, they give you something to paralyze you so that the abdominal muscles cooperate as they do their work. And that was why I couldn't move. I prayed, and I prayed that I would pass out so I wouldn't feel any more pain. But for reasons only God knows, this prayer went unanswered, and I did not pass out. I remained fully alert, but still completely paralyzed. Mentally, I screamed as loud as I could. I sang to myself, and I prayed some more as I fought the panic inside me. The surgery lasted for an hour and a half, and I had no choice but to lie there and wait for it to end. Fighting through the constant, excruciating pain and panic and suffocation was for me a true test of the human body's will to survive. Before this surgery happened, I thought I knew what it meant to feel afraid. We've all had things happen to us where we've felt fear. But I have never felt fear as intense as I did that day, and I wondered how I could survive something like this. The pain was so intense, unlike anything I've ever felt before, and I truly thought this was the end of my life. And so in the midst of the panic, I thanked God for my husband, Brian, our children, Kristen, and her husband, Tim, and our son, Derek. And I said a very special prayer for each of them. I thanked God for blessing me with such a wonderful family and a great life. And I prayed that they might know how much I loved them and how badly I wanted to stay here with them. Finally, the surgery was over. I heard the surgeon leave the OR, and I thought I was through the worst of it. But my ordeal wasn't over just yet. I noticed I was able to move my tongue a little bit, so in order to get someone's attention, I started to wiggle the breathing tube that was still in my throat. I did attract the anesthesiologist's attention, but to my horror, he simply removed the tube. The problem was that although I could move my tongue, the rest of me was still very paralyzed, and I was not yet able to breathe on my own. So with my life support gone, I was quite literally suffocating. I heard the nurse yell at me, "Breathe, Donna, breathe," but there was nothing I could do. I felt something bubbling out of my throat and running down the side of my face, and I knew instinctively I was in serious trouble. I could hear the panic in the nurse's voice as she yelled at me again and again. My lungs were burning, screaming for air, feeling like they were on fire. And once again, I thought that my time on this earth was over. I recall feeling very sad that my family might never know what my last hours on this earth were like, and asking God to help them cope with that. But then something amazing happened. I went to a wonderful place where it was very peaceful, quiet, and serene. I don't know where this place was, but I do know I was in the presence of God. I didn't feel afraid anymore. I felt warm and I felt safe. And so I prayed, "Lord, if it's my time to leave this earth, then please, please take me home." I then heard the most beautiful words. And he spoke to me and he said, "You're going to be okay. Whatever happens, you're going to be okay." I didn't know if I'd be able to stay here or if it was my time to die. But I knew that God was with me, and that was all that mattered. I felt such amazing peace, and I really did not want to leave this place. When I think now of how I felt at that moment, Philippians 4:7 always comes to mind, where it talks about the peace that passes all understanding. I have never felt peace like that before, and I now find myself longing for that peace. It was my comfort in the middle of a storm. I surrendered completely to God, and he heard my prayer. And I remember thinking at the time, if this is what it feels like to die, why are people so afraid of death? I had absolutely no fear. If we have accepted Christ, we have the assurance of eternal life in heaven. There is nothing to fear in death. Then just as suddenly as I had left, I returned to my body, and the OR sounds became louder again. I heard the anesthesiologist tell the nurse to bag me. So they put a mask on my face, and I felt the air being forced into my lungs. What a blessed relief. Within a few minutes, I was given some medication to counteract the paralytic. And within a few minutes, I was able to move my head. So in order to get their attention, I started throwing my head from side to side. Within a few minutes, I was able to start talking. And my first words were, "I was awake. I felt him cut me." I said this over and over, but not one of them said anything to me. They just looked at each other in shock. I was absolutely hysterical as I pleaded with them to go get Brian. I needed him so much. I kept asking for him until one of the nurses finally told me that I had to wait until recovery to see him. It seemed like forever until they finally took me into recovery, and my dear Brian was there. I immediately told him what had happened, and he turned to the nurse and asked her to go get the anesthesiologist. She told us that he'd already left the hospital, so we asked her to please go find him anyway. She did so, and when he came into the room, I told him for the second time what I had just been through. I will never forget his response. He would not look at me or come near my bed. He waited until I was done speaking. Then he shrugged his shoulders and he said 3 simple words. It happens sometimes. Then he turned and left without saying another word. I can't begin to describe how much those 3 simple words hurt me. I felt my self-esteem, self-worth, and so much more ripped out of my very heart and soul. I felt like my life didn't matter. He had left the OR during a surgical procedure, leaving no one to watch over me. I had just been through an extremely traumatic experience, and I needed compassion. I needed understanding, and especially an explanation. But he gave me nothing. And so for the second time that day, he abandoned me. I had said my mental goodbyes to my family, and all he gave me was, it happens sometimes. I was crushed. I was devastated. It was like feeling the scalpel slice through my flesh all over again, only this time the wounds were deep within my heart. We then asked to see the surgeon, and I once again repeated what had happened. I told him I felt him make the incision and felt the pain throughout the surgery. I told him the things that I'd heard him say in the OR, and he acknowledged every comment with, "Yes, I said that." With tears in his eyes and holding my hand, he listened, and I will not forget his kindness and compassion. When I was done, I asked the surgeon if he'd noticed that I had not asked him what the diagnosis was. He looked at me for a moment and he said, "You already know, don't you?" So instead of the surgeon telling his patient what the diagnosis was, I told him. And he turned to me and he said, "You are absolutely 100% correct." Only a few months, 3 months after this horrific experience, I was sent to Winnipeg for a second surgery. These were 3 extremely difficult months. I was still reeling from my horrific experience, and at the same time, I was now trying to prepare myself mentally for another surgery. I cried many tears during this time, wondering if I had the strength to go through with it, but knowing that I really didn't have any choice. I prayed many prayers, asking for strength and courage to face these fears. The morning of my surgery, Brian and I had a quiet ride to Winnipeg. He'd ask me every now and then if I was okay, and I'd say yes. My thoughts ran deep that morning, and I think I prayed almost the whole way to Winnipeg. When we got to the hospital, the staff at Health Sciences went out of their way to make it a more positive experience. They even let Brian stay with me in the pre-op room until they were ready for me in the OR, which I found out later is extremely rare. What a blessing that was. Another answer to our prayers. A few minutes before they took me to the OR, I thought I would pray just one more time. I tried, but no words came. I tried again, and still nothing came. I couldn't understand what was happening. But then it hit me as clearly as if someone whispered the words in my ear. There were so many people praying for me that morning that everything was taken care of. I was in the best hands possible, both physically and spiritually, and there was nothing left to worry about. Brian gave me a kiss, and I was wheeled into the OR with peace in my heart. Shortly after the incident happened, 3 months prior to this, I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. PTSD is a very complicated illness that few people understand. It can completely overwhelm a person's coping mechanisms and cause many, many problems. PTSD can have many triggers. For me, one of them is lying down. As soon as I lie down, whether it's on the couch, in my bed, on the recliner, it doesn't matter where, my heart rate goes up. The human body retains physical memory, so even if I'm not consciously thinking about what happened to me, my body remembers, and my heart goes into defense mode and starts to race. Other triggers can be something as simple as a voice on the phone, a bright light, like the ones you have in the ORs, or the feeling of not being able to breathe. Any one of these triggers can cause me to crash. It can take days, weeks, or even months to recover from one of these crashes. These are constant reminders for me, and I struggle with this every day. Living with PTSD is very difficult. I do not handle stress well. I have had to retrain my brain and learn new ways of coping. Things that would never have bothered me before can now become magnified and completely overwhelm me within seconds. It will always catch me off guard. I never know what might be a potential trigger, when it will hit, or how hard. I have cried many tears wishing it would just disappear. I try to be strong, at least on the outside, but more often than not, I fail miserably. The PTSD also affects my short-term memory. The part of my brain that processes and retains thoughts has been traumatized and damaged. So there are many, many times when I simply forget things. One of them that I really struggle with is praying. It's hard to imagine, isn't it, forgetting to pray? It makes me feel so guilty when I can't. It's not always like this, but I do notice it more when I feel stressed. There are also times when I can't concentrate long enough to manage more than a simple, "Lord, help me." But even though our prayers may be so simple and childlike, God hears and answers those prayers as well. Around this time, there was a thought for the week in our church bulletin that really resonated with me. It read, "When you think God is all you have, you find out that God is all you need." It's a wonderful reminder that God is with me every step of the way. I always say that during that hour and a half in the OR, I did not suffer alone. God held my hand when no one else could. It was He and I suffering together. He felt my pain, my fear. He wiped the tears I couldn't cry. I never doubted His presence, and I know that He held me close as I struggled to survive that terrible day. This next part is especially difficult to share. A few years ago, I had a PTSD trigger and I crashed hard. I reached my lowest point since the awareness happened. I shook uncontrollably for several days. I did not eat, I could not sleep, and I was an absolute wreck. I cried for 3 days straight. The nightmares became extremely intense, and there was one night when things were exceptionally bad. Since this happened, I've had to take sleeping pills in order to get any rest. And so that night, I had taken my pills as usual, but I knew I was in for a rough night. I then did something I had never done before. I asked Brian to hide my medications for me. I told him I was so afraid of the dreams and the nightmares, and I thought that if I kept the meds in my usual spot next to my bed, I might unknowingly take too many before fully waking up. I'll never forget the look on his face. I could see confusion, worry, and pain in his eyes. He didn't know what to think. I tried to reassure him, but I don't think I succeeded. I cried in his arms as he held me. I didn't admit it to myself or to Brian for a long time, but I had some very dark thoughts that night, and those medications looked very, very inviting. I was near the breaking point, and I desperately wanted the pain to go away. Part of me wanted to give up. I was so tired of fighting the PTSD and people not understanding what I'm going through. I was tired of pretending to be the same person I was before all of this happened. People still look at me and sometimes even say to my face, "Well, there's nothing wrong with you, you look fine." Or they'll say with something like, "Are you still dealing with that? I thought you'd be long through that by now." But they don't see the pain and the anguish on the inside. I want desperately to be me again, and it's taken me a long time to accept that I will never be the person I was before the critical incident. During this dark time, a friend of mine gave me some wonderful advice. She said, "Don't think about the person you used to be. Think about the person you are becoming." What wonderful, encouraging words. And it was exactly what I needed to hear. I've had a glimpse of what I call the dark side. In my heart, I did not want to go down that path, but my mind was trying to convince me otherwise. I cried out to God, and once again, He was there for me. I should also note that during this time, there were many, many people praying for me. And I credit those prayers for getting me through, and I wish I could thank everyone who prayed for me during the times when I couldn't do so myself. A few months later, my doctor decided the PTSD was too much, and he put me on medical leave. This was a huge blow, and I took it hard. I basically withdrew from society. I was embarrassed. After all, mental illness and the stigma surrounding it are still very much alive and well in our society today. I felt ashamed that I was not strong enough to conquer this unwelcomed illness in my life. And I felt guilty that I had brought this monster called PTSD into our lives and home. And so I withdrew more and more. I basically stayed at home. I stopped going to church. I didn't want people to see me, and I didn't want to see them. I felt judged, I felt alone, and I felt broken. I wondered why God had seemingly forgotten about me. It was only when our daughter, who was 19 at the time, asked me why I stopped attending church that my eyes were open, and I thought, my children are noticing that I don't go to church anymore. What kind of example am I setting? I knew God was working in my heart, and slowly I began to attend once again. Deep down, I knew He had not forgotten about me. He spoke to me through the messages Pastor Ben gave and through the songs we sung. I knew my insecurities did not come from a lack of faith, that it was the PTSD interfering, but it didn't make it any easier. In time, I found that I felt better when I talked about what had happened to me. These days, we hear a lot about mental health in the media. I am slowly coming to terms with having a mental illness and speaking openly about it. It's not easy, but I am determined to create awareness and acceptance of mental illness. We can easily discuss other illnesses such as diabetes, cancer, addictions, and such. So why can we not openly discuss and support those with mental illness? Let's be open to listening, to showing compassion, and perhaps we can learn something from one another instead. I have a small plaque in our kitchen that I've had for years, but now it holds a very special place in my heart. And it says, "Lord, help me to remember that nothing will happen to me today that you and I together can't handle. Without our precious Lord, I shudder to think of where I would be today. Most likely, I wouldn't be here anymore. But in the midst of whatever trials He sends our way, we must always remember that He is in control. We all have a story. We are all given challenges in life, and it's up to us as to what we do with them. When life becomes overwhelming, hang on to the thought that God will never give us more than we can handle. I've been reminded of this many times during church services, in songs, from friends and family, and sometimes my sense of humor kicks in, and I respond by saying, I know God will never give me more than I could handle. It's just that sometimes I wish He didn't think I could handle quite this much. But seriously, our God has big shoulders, and how wonderful to know that we can always count on Him. Joshua 1-5, I will never leave you nor forsake you. This experience has taught me a lot about patience, forgiveness, faith, and much, much more. It has taught me that life is precious and our time is short. Life can change in an instant and never be the same again. It has also taught me that 10% of life is what happens to you, and 90% is how you react to it. Now, I'm no saint, nor do I pretend to be. There are still many days when it's extremely difficult to forgive those who hurt me. When the PTSD triggers come and I feel like giving up, I honestly don't always feel like forgiving. But in order to heal, I need to make that conscious choice to forgive. And it's a choice I have to make every single day. Not always the easiest thing to do, but it is necessary in order to heal and move forward. A friend of mine who is a world-renowned expert on awareness once shared an article about a patient in the U.S. who had an experience very similar to mine. As part of her ongoing therapy, she was encouraged to return to the hospital where her incident happened for what is called cognitive behavioral therapy. Another term is exposure therapy. This type of treatment is often used when someone has been exposed to an extremely traumatic experience. It is a controlled exposure to the very trauma that hurt you. It is very successful in overcoming the intense fear that often accompanies PTSD. And so with the help of my therapist, we decided to give this a try as well. So arrangements were made for Brian and I to visit the hospital where my incident happened. The medical director agreed to meet us and answer any questions we had. A few weeks before the meeting, the medical director contacted me with a request. She said that the 2 nurses who attended my case wanted to know if they could be present when we visited the hospital. I wasn't sure I was ready to face them, but after thinking and praying about it, I agreed. I was very anxious as we made the drive to the hospital that Saturday morning. It was so difficult to walk into that place. The smells, the lights, the memories, they were almost too much. We were invited into a small room where I faced those nurses for the first time since that eventful day. I began by telling them what that day had been like for me. I spoke of what had happened and what I felt should have happened. I spoke of how their actions, or the lack thereof, had hurt me. I shared how the PTSD has affected my life and my family. I think I cried through the whole meeting. When I was through, both nurses apologized for their roles in my case. There were many tears, hugs, and apologies. A few years later, we were able to convince the anesthesiologist to have a similar meeting with us. This required intense mental preparation on my part. I didn't sleep much in the days leading up to that meeting, and when the day finally arrived, I was ready. We sat down, and I began to speak. And once again, I shared what that day had been like for me and the impact of the awareness and the subsequent PTSD. And once again, I cried through the entire meeting. When I was done speaking, the first response from the anesthesiologist was an apology. With hugs and tears, I accepted his apology and extended forgiveness. We left both meetings feeling like a tremendous weight had been lifted from our shoulders. I think the anesthesiologist and the nurses needed those meetings just as much as we did. It was definitely a healing experience for all of us. It took us years to convince them this was necessary, and though we wanted these meetings to take place much sooner than they actually did, I believe it was God's will that I needed to wait. Looking back on the timeline, I realized that I wasn't really ready for it to happen when I thought it should happen, until God decided I was ready and allowed it to happen. As my husband can attest, patience is not one of my virtues. But God has shown me repeatedly that He is in control and that I must be patient and wait until the time is right for certain things to happen. It's always in His time, not mine. I knew from the start that I did not want others to go through a similar experience. I prayed many prayers asking God for wisdom and guidance in how I reacted to those responsible and how to turn this terrible experience into something better. I still pray for the strength to forgive. At that time, I had no idea how He might answer. All I knew was that I could not do this on my own. I do not possess that kind of strength. As time goes by and my healing process continues, I've had many amazing opportunities to share my story with many different audiences. And God has shown me time and time and time again that He continues to guide and comfort me. He is the one who gives me the strength to stand here and the words to speak. He is truly a wonderful God, and all the praise and glory goes to Him. Another one of my favorite verses is Hebrews 13:5. I will never leave you nor forsake you. I know firsthand how true this is. God has seen me through some extremely dark times and is still holding my hand today, leading me on. I have learned to lean on Him more than ever before and to trust in His will. My struggles are far from over, but I rejoice in the fact that my Lord is with me every second of every day. He will never leave me. Another one of my favorite passages is Psalms 121. I will lift up my eyes unto the hills. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. He will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, He who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord watches over you. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your life. The Lord will watch over your coming and going, both for now and evermore. I came across a little poem, the other day, and I thought it was such a fitting way to end my talk this morning. It's a gentle reminder for us that there's always hope. It's called You Say. You say it's impossible. God says, with me all things are possible. You say, I'm exhausted. He says, wait on me, I will renew your strength. You say, I can't go on. He says, my grace is sufficient for you. You say, I can't do it. He says, you can do all things through me. You say, it's not worth it. He says, it will be. Just keep going. You say, I'm afraid. He says, I didn't give you the spirit of fear, but of power. You say, I can't handle this. He says, give it to me. I'll carry it for you. You say, I'm all alone. And He says, I will never leave you nor forsake you. The recovery process for me has been and continues to be a long, hard road. But thankfully, God has blessed me with a wonderful husband, children, and grandchildren who are always there to support me. The invisible scars will always remain, but I have been given a precious gift. God spoke to me that day. And when I think of the words that I heard in the OR, I know that someday, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday, in God's time, I will be okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Donna, for